So our next speaker is Elise Sussman. She is a professor in the departments of neuroscience and otolaryngology HNS at the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Her research is in the area of cognitive neuroscience, using behavioral and electrophysiological measures to gain a better understanding of the neurobiological basis of auditory scene perception from infancy to adulthood. Her talk today will be on auditory scene analysis and attention perspective.
Good morning. I first want to thank Karen for inviting me. I am delighted to be here and have this opportunity to share some of the research from my laboratory with you today. I first am told that I need to disclose that I have nothing to disclose. Attention plays an important role in how we perceive and understand the environment. So today in my talk, I am going to focus on some experiments that demonstrate how we process and organize sound to form coherent events in the environment that are useful for perception. And this involves, yes? Okay, yes. I think that Barb said that one didn't work. I could, can you hear me now? Is that better? Is that better? Okay. And I just want to see how this pointer thing works. If that doesn't work, so then I need that one. Does? Okay. Oops.
Testing.
Okay. Okay. So is that better? Okay. So what I was saying was that this process of identifying the events involves an interaction between automatic or stimulus-driven and attention processing that facilitates our ability to navigate in noisy environments. And I'm first going to give you an outline, a brief outline of what I'm going to go through in my talk today. First, I'm going to define auditory scene analysis, and then I'm going to talk to you a bit about how we measure brain processes that are associated with auditory scene analysis, and then I'm going to go into how attention influences scene processing, and there are three parts to this, from the stimulus-driven or automatic processing, how do we represent sound, and then how attention modifies what we perceive. So the first thing is, what is auditory scene analysis? So auditory scene analysis is a fundamental skill of the auditory system that allows us to perceive and identify events in the environment. It's that skill that allows you, as you heard Barbara talk about, it's that skill that allows you to select out the voice of your friend in a noisy restaurant and listen to them, or that you can listen to and focus in on a melody of the flute in an orchestra. So the interesting thing about this, if I were to ask you to come and join me at this cocktail party, you would hear people talking, you would hear glasses clinking, the wind is blowing in the background, maybe there's music playing. And it is the sounds that enter your ears in a mixture from all the sounds in the environment. And then the brain disentangles the sounds to provide neural representations that maintain the integrity of these distinct sources. And this is the process of stream segregation, segregating them out and maintaining these distinct representations. And this is what we're trying to understand. What does the brain do? What happens automatically? And how does attention modify what we perceive? So I'm going to give you an example, because in my talk today also I'm going to talk about, not about speech at all, I'm going to talk about simple sounds, tone processing. So I'm going to use an example from music. And composers have known about this remarkable ability of the auditory system for hundreds of years. And this piece is one of my favorite examples of auditory stream segregation. It's by a composer named Francisco Tárrega, a Spanish composer. He's actually now most famous for this little phrase in one of his solo pieces, compositions. He's for composing this. Let me see if I can do this. The Nokia tune, so there you go. But in this piece of music, we have one timbre, one sound source, the guitar. And sounds, as you can look at this is the beginning of the score here. The sounds are played sequentially across a range of frequencies, and what you'll experience is multiple sound streams that occur simultaneously but converge harmonically. Now, this particular piece of music, guitar piece, uses a challenging guitar technique called the tremolo. And what that is the guitarist plucks on a single melodic note with these three fingers of one hand, and you can see that they look sort of like triplets here. And in the thumb, they play a counter bass melody. And it's a very challenging technique for a guitarist. But what you're going to experience is separate sound streams, two melodic streams. And if you don't know the story that I'm telling now, and you were to hear it without a visual of a man playing a guitar, people often think it's a duet of two guitars. So I'm going to let you listen to this now. So hopefully you got a flavor for how that goes with the sustained note and the melodic below. And to take this into the laboratory of playing sounds sequentially and how you segregate them out and hear them as integrated or segregated streams, in our laboratory we have an example here with some different frequency tones that are played sequentially. It's sort of in a waltzing rhythm, bum, 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 bum. And what we do is we vary the distance between the two sets of sounds, and then we want to know how those sets of sounds are represented in the brain as either one or two streams and how people perceive them. So here, when they're integrated, you can see this sort of waltzing tune, and if they're segregated in frequency, you might hear them as two distinct frequency streams, and then they have a different rhythm. There's a synchronous rhythm in the bottom and a little flutter in the top of the second stream. So before we get into the experiments, I want to explain a little bit of how we use electrophysiology to measure what the brain is doing with the sounds. So event-related brain potentials are really excellent tools for understanding how sound is indexed in memory and how it's held in memory. And the way that we get the event-related brain potentials is we record the EEG, as Barbara was talking about. We use an electrode cap, and here's one of our happy subjects. And as we record the EEG, we want to extract the evoked potentials from that continuous EEG recording so that we can look at the voltage changes that are time-locked to the specific events that we're interested in. And I'm going to give you a further detail about how this works. I was assuming that some of you in the audience might not be quite so familiar with it. So here's how we do it. The subject is sitting in a chair in a sound attenuated booth. They have the cap on with the electrodes. They're hooked up to the amplifier. They have insert earphones in their ears. We're recording their EEG, and we play sounds through the insert earphones. And for each sound, it's time-locked, stamped onto the EEG record, so that when they go home, we can then analyze what is the brain's response time-locked to a particular sound that we're interested in. And what we do is we segment out those pieces that occur a little before and a little bit after the sound event. And we segment them out and average them together because the brain activity is quite noisy. We get all the spontaneous neural activity, and we want to know what is the specific response to the events that we're interested in. And as we average together these multiple trials, we get what emerges is a time and phase-locked ERP component. And it has changes in the polarity of this waveform. And this is a classic auditory evoked potential that you're looking at here, an obligatory response just to the sound onset. And what you see on the y-axis is the display of microvolts, the amplitude of the response, and across the x-axis we have time. So you see this is a very rapid response from time onset. And if you follow from the baseline, we have three main components that have different polarities. We have a P50, P1, which peaks around 50 milliseconds. It's the first positive peak, followed by a negative potential that peaks around 100 milliseconds. We call that N1, the first negative peak. And then there's a second positive peak around 170 milliseconds. And this is the classic onset obligatory response. But when we want to know what the brain is doing with the sounds, we want to get a little more complicated. And we want to understand how they're processing a multitude of sounds. So now what we want to do, this is the obligatory response. We want to know, this is the exogenous, what's happening stimulus driven. We want to know what's happening internally, endogenously. So we present what we call an auditory oddball is one example of what we might do. We repeat a sound over and over, and in this case, we change the frequency of the sound represented in pink here. And we want to know, did the brain detect the difference between the repeating regularity, which we call the standard, and the pink one that changed in frequency, which we call the deviant. So we average together the response to all of the standard sounds, which is the black ones that I showed you and you're looking at. And then we average together the response to all of the randomly infrequent occurring deviant sounds that's represented here in pink. And you can see overlaying with the obligatory components, the P1, N1, and P2, there's a negative displacement that begins around 100 milliseconds and continues through the P2 response. And that negative displacement that's based on the standard is what we call the mismatch negativity. It's the index that the brain detected something different happened here. And we get this negative displacement. And the way we visualize the MMN is we subtract the standard ERP evoked response that we got from the deviant response, and it eliminates, the subtraction eliminates the obligatory components and leaves you with a peak latency of change detection, the mismatch negativity component. And this is a frontal electrode site where we see the greatest signal-to-noise ratio for the mismatch negativity. Now, the mismatch negativity component, the reason why I'm going into so much detail is the measure that I'm going to use for all of the experiments that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to give you a little bit of information on why this is such a valuable tool for looking at auditory scene analysis. The first thing about it is that it's generated, it's modality specific. It's generated within auditory cortices, so we know where we are in the brain. The second thing is that we don't have to ask the listener what they heard to index sound change detection. So we can record the sounds coming in the ears, and we can understand what's going on in the background when the listener is doing something else in the scene, whether it's visual or auditory. They can be ignoring the sounds, in other words, and they have to hear the sounds, but they can be not doing a task with them for this change detection response to occur, or they can be actually listening to and pressing the key for the deviance, and we also get the MMN. So we can understand what's happening, we can learn about what's happening for unattended sounds when attention is directed in many different ways, whether it's ignoring the sounds or attending to the sounds. And the last thing that's really crucial, because we want to understand about sound organization at a somewhat later level, how they're represented in memory, the MMN is strongly context dependent, and context dependent means its elicitation is based not simply on the features of the sound, but on the memory of the history of the sounds that have been ongoing. And I'm going to give you what I find quite a striking demonstration of what that means, not in a scene analysis situation, but just with two tones that we did early on in my lab. Here's the random oddball, where we present this tone 20% of the time randomly in a sequence with another series of sounds. And as I just demonstrated, when we do that, we get an MMN elicited by the deviant. And what we would say the standard is this repeating regularity in time, location, intensity, duration of the sound. And the only thing that changed in the case that I showed you was the frequency of the sound. We could change any feature and the same thing would occur. We could change intensity or any other feature. And so we get MMN based on the standard. The standard is the context and the deviant is this change in frequency. But if we take those same two tones with the same exact probability, except now what we're doing is we're going to group the sequence of sounds so that the deviant occurs every fifth tone, or the pink frequency occurs every fifth tone. So it occurs the same probability, but now there's a sequence of 5 tones that repeat, repeat, repeat. And now what happens is MMN is no longer elicited by the deviant that occurred before. And the reason for that is that even though it's infrequent in the block, and it is a different frequency than the black squares represented here, what is the standard now is this, if the brain detects it, is this 5-tone repeating regularity. And you don't get an MMN from a standard, you get an MMN from something that's detected as being different. And so now this frequency of tone is no longer deviant. So the thing that you should understand about MMN, which is something that I learned, did not know when I was a student doing my PhD, and learned this later, very early though, as I was working on it, was that you don't elicit MMN simply by having an infrequent frequency or feature that occurs in the sequence. There has to be a standard that's detected that serves as a basis. And most of the MMN studies that were done used the oddball paradigm, so the standard was just a repeating sound, and so everybody just thought that was as far as it went, but it's much more complicated. And so when MMN is elicited, you know that a change was detected, and you can infer what the standard was. And that's going to form the basis of all the experiments I talk about, and I'll talk about the different standards in a little more detail. So the first thing I'm going to speak about is what happens automatically. What happens when you don't have a task with the sounds? Are they organized, or are they have simply background noise? How are the sounds sorted and stored in memory when you have no task with the sounds? And what I'm going to show you is that this stream segregation process is very primitive, as Al Bregman speculated in his early work, that it occurs automatically, without any task with the sounds. Now, to explain this, I need to go through a few processes because I'm going to show you a number of different things that occur in this particular situation that we're looking at, not just stream segregation. So first I'm going to talk about a phenomenon that we discovered when I was earlier on. And now we're going to look here at the influence of the context, but not in a stream segregation situation, just how the context influences how we process sounds in the environment. So here what we have is as you can see, a somewhat modified oddball, that every time a deviant occurs, another deviant follows it. Every time a deviant occurs, another deviant follows it. And the thing to notice here is we have a very rapid ISI, a very rapid stimulus onset rate of 150 milliseconds, which is within the temporal window of integration. So we would say that some elements that fall within the temporal window of integration tend to get integrated together. So that you need to note that because it works differently with longer stimulus rates. And I'm going to play this for you, and you can listen and also see if you can hear them as single or double deviants. Okay, so every time a deviant occurred, another one follows it. And what we found was that we got one MMN to those 2 successive events. And we interpret this to mean that in this situation, every time a deviant occurred, there were 2, so this was one deviant event. Now, another way you might interpret it is you might say, well, maybe the MMN generators are refractory and they just can't put out 2 MMNs within 150 milliseconds. Well, we ran another condition where we mixed up what the deviants were. So now, every time a deviant occurred, it wasn't fully predicted that another deviant would follow it. We had what we'll call single deviants and double deviants in the block at the same pace. And now what happened was we got 2 MMNs to this same exact physical input, put out 2 MMNs in the mixed condition, whereas 1 MMN in the block condition. And what this indicates here is that this second deviant is giving new information. So we need to represent that in a different way, and even at this very rapid pace, you can see that the MMN is distinguishing. And there's one other thing to look at here. When they were integrated together, you can see the peak latency, the MMN was longer, than when they were 2 separate ones. These are separated by 150 milliseconds. Remember, the timing with evoked potentials is very precise. So we have the timing of these 2 MMNs 150 milliseconds apart. So you can see clearly that the context of having this single deviant influenced whether this exact same input was processed as 1 or 2 events. Okay. Now, we take that phenomenon in a single stream, an oddball, into a streaming paradigm. And now what we did was we have this set of low sounds, 440 hertz, and then a set of higher sounds quite far away, so they should automatically segregate if you're not paying attention to the sounds. But now the pace is 75 milliseconds onset to onset. And so you have 75 milliseconds from low to high, they're alternating. And we maintain this 150 milliseconds between double deviants, the same that we saw, but the only difference is that now we have a tone that actually occurs in the input to the ear. There's a high tone that occurs in between every low tone, so there's a tone here. And what we wanted to know was that if the sounds segregate automatically and you get a representation of the low and a representation of the high held separately in memory, then the contextual effects can occur on the low stream. And should we get 1 MMN in the block condition and 2 MMNs in the mixed condition? And the converse would be true. If they're not segregating automatically, then they have all these tones occurring in the middle, and we should get 2 MMNs in both situations. But what happened was we found that we got 1 MMN in the block condition and 2 MMNs in the mixed condition, which to us indicates that the within-stream event formation is based on the already segregated input. So if you think about yourself in a cocktail party that we were visiting before, and the first thing that happens when you enter the room is all the sounds are segregated based on the spectrotemporal characteristics of the input, and then the events that are within every stream get formed. So you're listening to your friend talking or listening to a melody, and you're making the calculation of what events are in that stream based on the already segregated information that we have. So let's put that into a schematic model of what would be happening here. Look at all of the different processes that are happening bottom-up fashion. We have the sound input coming in. It gets parsed based on the spectral temporal cues, and then the streams are formed, events are formed on the already segregated information, and then so the standards are formed here, and then the deviance detection occurs, and then we get MMN. A lot is happening before MMN output, which is already at 150 milliseconds. Okay, so that was the first thing we talked about. The second is, now we're going to look at how does attention act on this, the neural representations. How does it modify what it is that you're hearing? What does attention do in these complex scenes? So the first thing attention does is we find that it can sharpen stream segregation. So now you're going to recognize that little waltzing pattern that I showed you before. This is one of the paradigms that we've used in the lab. And what we have here is we wanted to know what the brain was doing with the sound in both passive and active listening conditions. And we wanted to have a perceptual measure, but we wanted to have 2 perceptual measures so that we could get some converging evidence about how things were being heard. And so we had 2 behavioral tasks. And one I'm calling, experiment 1, I'm calling global perception. So we had these different frequencies, and we separated the frequencies at varying distances. And we played them to the subject with different frequency separations, and we asked the subject, do you hear 1 stream, or does it sound more like 2 streams going on simultaneously? And in the second experiment, we recorded the EEG while we had them perform the behavioral task. And we took the same sets of sounds, but this time we wanted to, we had them actively segregating out the low stream here. And I'm going to describe how we did this because it's important for you to understand why and how MMN would be elicited to know how this part of the experiment would work. So, and because the loudness detection task is predicated on their ability to segregate out that low stream from the other intervening sounds. So here's how this task works. We have an oddball, and this time we're going to have an intensity oddball, not a frequency oddball. And so if we look here at 440 hertz is the sound, and I'm calling them X tones just to be able to call this that stream. And these X tones were played at 66 dB/SPL, and the probe tone, I'll call it the probe tone because it isn't always a deviant, was 78 dB. So we have 12 dB difference. And if you play a random 10% of the time this probe tone occurred randomly amongst a 66 dB, it's a very easy task to do. And the subject would just press the key every time they hear the louder sound. So it's a loudness detection task. Now what we did was we put 2 tones intervening in between every one of the X tones. And now the pace of sounds is 10 hertz. It's one sound every 100 milliseconds. Now, we have the sounds that are intervening have intensities that vary above and below the standard and the deviant. And we did that so that the listener couldn't anchor onto the softest or the loudest sound to find the deviant. It had to be segregated out, and so it was buried in amongst all these other intensities. Now, if the sounds were integrated together, and you're doing this waltzing rhythm, then you have a flurry of intensity, right? Because intensity changes randomly from tone to tone to tone, and there's no standard to be detected. But if the sounds are segregated, and this lower stream, the X tones, form its own stream, then you have an intensity standard and an intensity deviant. So if the MMN is evoked, if it's elicited, then we know that the streams were represented in the brain as segregated for that standard to emerge in the low stream and the deviant to be detected. And so we're going to have listeners watching a movie and ignoring the sounds in one condition, and we're going to have them paying attention to and actively segregating out the sounds and pressing the key when they hear that louder deviant and ignoring the higher sounds in the other condition. So first I'll show you the behavioral results because we had both of those experiments. And what you see here is that we use semitones. So if any of you are, even if you don't play a musical instrument, most of us have seen a piano. A semitone is from the white key to a black key. That's one semitone distance. And it's on a logarithmic scale. So whether you play from a C to a C sharp in the low range or a C to C sharp in the high range, it's the same interval, one semitone distance, even though the absolute frequency value of those C sharp in the low range and C sharp in the high range are not the same distance. So we have that we used one semitone, which is the smallest distance on the piano, and up to 5, 7, 7, and 11 semitones, which is just under an octave. And on the y-axis, we show for the experiment 1, where we asked them, do you hear 1 or 2 streams? We are recording the proportion of times they said they heard 2 streams. And for the loudness detection task, I'm showing you here the hit rate. And what you notice that as the frequency separation got larger as you go this way along the axis, the ability to perform the task increased, and the proportion of times a person said they heard 2 streams was also increased. So that was similar in both cases. And you can see that at 1 semitones, they almost never said they heard 2 streams, and at 11 semitones, they almost always said it sounded like 2 streams. And the other thing here is that these 2 measures were consistent with each other. So we feel that they're measuring, it seems, the same thing. When a subject said they heard 2 streams, they did pretty well in the loudness detection task. Just as a side note, this isn't true in children who have language impairments. But it is in typically developing children. So this is a very consistent between these two measures. So now let's look at what happens with passive listening. They're sitting in the booth, sounds are coming in their ears, they're watching a movie, and they have closed caption video to keep their attention onto the movie. And what we see is there's an MMN elicited by the oddball. There are no intervening tones, and we're showing the mastoid electrode as well because we want to identify that we're in auditory cortex. So we're showing the dipole relationship between FC and the mastoid of the neurons that are oriented perpendicular that are in auditory cortex. So we often show this dipole relationship so we can landmark ourselves within auditory cortex. And you see a nice robust MMN here. And you see that at 11 semitones with the interfering tones, there's still a significant MMN elicited, but it's considerably smaller. And with 7 semitones as well, there's no difference between these two. But by 5 semitones, there was no MMN. So we would say here that you needed at least a 7 semitone separation when you're not attending to the sounds, when they're in the background, for them to be represented robustly enough as 2 distinct streams in memory. 5 semitones is the distance where we would say they were ambiguous, where the subject would report most of the time. Half the time they say they're hear it as 1 stream, half the time they say it hears more as 2 streams. So it's not always clear, and it wasn't robust enough when they're watching a movie and with no task for them to be represented here as 2 streams. So there's no MMN elicited, and of course not at 1 semitone. Now we're having them actively segregate the sounds. We're telling them to pull out the low stream and listen for the louder tone. Press it every time you hear the louder tone. And now you see, of course, there's a robust MMN elicited by the oddball. And again, this is why we need this mastoid inversion to show you this dipole relationship, because you notice these 2 other important components that are elicited here. These are target detection responses called N2P3B. And they are non-modality specific. They're not elicited within auditory cortex. And so you don't have that inversion over the N2. So we have the sequence of events to the change detection. The louder tone was detected, and then these are the target responses that go along with your reaction time. So you see a nice robust response at 11, at 7, and even at 5 semitones. So when you're using your attention to pull out what you want to hear, attention can refine the stream segregation process so that you can represent 2 streams at smaller frequencies than you would do if you were looking around the room and you had things going on in the background. So let's put this now into our model. We have the sound coming in, and we know that the parsing is happening automatically because we use very large frequency separation. So where is attention acting? Attention is acting on the stream formation process. We can force it that we can hear, as I just said, at smaller frequency separations. We can segregate out the sounds with our attention, which then allows us to then form the standards, detect the deviance, and MMN is elicited at 5 semitones when we're listening. Okay, what else can attention do? Attention can override processes of the automatic system. So now I'm going to use a different paradigm here, not the simple oddball paradigm. This was the paradigm that I used from my dissertation. And here, instead of having a simple oddball, which I didn't want to have, and I'm going to explain why in a minute, I used a complicated 3-tone sequence, 3-tone rising pitch pattern, let's call it that. But what we have, again, it's a very fast, rapid rate. It's 10 hertz. And the sounds are entering the ear as high, low, high, low, high, low, high, low. And we have we have a rising pitch pattern in each one. Now, what's interesting about this, so we have a standard, if they segregate, then you have a standard pattern, pitch pattern, and a similar one in the low stream. Before I play this for you, I need to tell you something because I will challenge you to listen for it. This is somewhat of an auditory illusion because the input to the ears, as you can see in the bottom line, is high, low, high, low, high, low, high, low. When you listen to the sounds, you can't hear the alternating pattern at this rapid rate. What happens is you automatically segregate them, and you can listen back and forth to the pitch patterns, and you can try to hear the alternation. Most people can't. It'd be interesting to know if somebody felt that they could. This is a short sample. I'll play it twice. I'll play it again. Most of the time what dominates is that rising pitch pattern in the low and the rising pitch pattern in the high. And you can flip back and forth and listen to the low and the high and find both of them. Okay. So one of the reasons why I wanted to use this pattern standard is because at the time that I was working on this experiment, the thinking back then was that any sound that differed in any parameter would elicit an MMN, like a global MMN. So what we did here is we reversed the order of the elements. So there was no new elements involved, there were no new frequencies, no new intensities, nothing was new in here. In order for you to identify the deviance, you had to identify the order of the deviance and know that it was occurring in the reverse order. Now in this experiment, because I'm not going to go into that was part of my first experiment, but in this experiment, because I want to talk about attention a little bit here, what I did in what we have here is we have a deviant that occurs in the low stream followed by a deviant that occurs in the high stream. Every time a deviant occurs in the low stream, a deviant occurs in the high stream. And this is across streams. It's the other time I showed you the double deviant, it was in the same stream. And of course, it goes across a longer time course, but there is only about 100 milliseconds in between the offset of this and the onset of this one. Okay. Now, when we did that and the subject was watching a movie, we found an MMN elicited to the first one, the low tone deviant, but there was no MMN to the high tone deviant. Now, you heard the sounds, they clearly sound segregated, and you would think that you could hear them both distinctly. So there were a number of things that were going on. They were watching a movie, they didn't have a task with the sounds. It could have been that it was detected as a long double deviant, or it could have been that there was so much going on that they detected one deviant and then didn't really catch on with what was happening anymore because they weren't paying attention there. But you can clearly hear if you are listening to it. So we had subjects come in for another condition, and this time we said, we want you to focus in on the high sounds, ignore the low sounds, and press the key every time you hear the reversal of order in the high stream. And that's what they did. And what you see, the black trace shows the response to the high tone. So you see they're doing the task. There's the N2B, P3B. They knew that the high tone deviant was their task. There's no N2, P3 in the low because they were ignoring them, even though they were intervening in between every one. They're alternating low, high, low, high, low, high. So that's pretty remarkable. So we have an MMN now and an N2B, P3B, and you see that the low tone deviant is still being detected automatically in the same latency and amplitude as it was when they were watching the movie and had no task with the sounds. So what we say here is that attention could, well, let's look at it here. We have the sound input and automatically streaming, and before we showed modulation at the stream formation level, now we're showing modulation at the event formation level. When you are paying attention to the previously obscured events that were happening, now with attention you can pull them out. And now that allowed you to detect the deviance, and MMN was elicited. So what was previously obscured by whatever automatic process is going on and you had no task with the sounds, attention can then override these automatic limitations when you need to listen for something that's going on in the scene. And lastly, I'm going to show, we know that attention can select a subset of information. But here, we were interested in both of the experiments, or the few experiments that I just explained to you. Whenever you actively segregated out one stream, there was only one option left over. You only had one other stream left over. So if you're segregating out a low stream, you only have a high stream left over. You can see here that we took the paradigm that I just showed you, this complicated rising pitch pattern paradigm, and now added in a third frequency stream. And now the sounds are going low, middle, high, low, middle, high, low, middle, high. So there are two tones intervening in between every high tone, or in between every stream of tones. And now we want to know that when you're attending to, in this case it's going to be the high stream, what does the brain do with the background sounds? Are they organized or are they noise? And I'm going to let you listen to it now with the three streams. And what we had the subject do was attend to the high tones. And we have in here, the high tone stream is an oddball, but it has the single deviance and double deviance. So again, we didn't want the subject just to press the key every time another sound popped out because they occur randomly. We wanted them to pay attention to the high stream and perform a task. So they pressed the key every time they heard only the double deviant. So they had to listen, and it wasn't that they just pressed the key anytime a deviant occurs. They pressed the key only when the double deviant occurred. It was a very difficult task. And now we have this in the unattended background. It's a very complicated, it's not just simple oddballs. We have patterns back there. If the patterns emerge, then we should get an MMN to the pattern reversal in the low and to the pattern reversal in the high. And just to note, these are not double deviants. I separated them out so there was no issue of them interfering with each other. Okay, so now what happened? So when all of the sounds were in the background and they were watching a movie, MMN was elicited by the double deviant, which was their target that you see here, was elicited by the middle tone pattern deviant and by the low tone pattern deviant. So the sounds were automatically segregated, and we made the distance between them more than 7 semitones so that they would automatically segregate if they could. And we had them watch the movie, and we had never done it with 3 streams, so we didn't really know for sure what would happen there. And you can see that they segregated out automatically when they were watching the movie, and they were in the background. Now, when we had them actively do this detection task, you can see clearly there's the MMN to the first, MMN to the second. Remember, there are 2 intervening tones in there, and there's the N2B, P3B. That was their task. But in the background, this is the background now, you can clearly see there was no MMNs elicited. So attention to do the task with part of the auditory scene modulated what was happening to the unattended information. But here's the interesting, well, that was interesting, but here's how we're interpreting what might be going on there. So before I showed you that the sound input comes in, and now we have attention modulating what gets parsed out. We're parsing out a subset of that information, and now we have the background. And in the attended stream, that stream you're attending to forms its own stream, the events can be heard, and we saw that deviants were detected, and we got MMN. But what's happening now in the background? There are more than one possibilities on where the limitation occurred that interfered with the ability for the MMN to come out. It's possible that attention preempted the stream segregation process, and that when you're listening to your friend talking in a noisy room, the rest is background, there's no structure. The other possibility is that when you're listening to your friend in the noisy room, there's structure to the other events going on. You know if it's a male or a female speaker, but you don't know whether they're talking about China or Germany. Well, I don't know why I picked 2 countries. I could have said cooking or reading. But what happens here is we had those 3-tone pitch patterns, and the other possibility is that the sounds were grossly segregated by frequency, but because your resources, your attentional resources, were so focused for doing this very difficult task, even though you knew there were 2 different streams back there, you didn't know what was in them. You didn't know what the events were that were in them. And then the event formation would be blocked. Now, we've since done a follow-up study which showed just that. We used entrainment, similar to what Barbara was talking about before, and we used different rhythms. We changed the paradigm a little bit so we could look at what the rhythms were in each stream. And what we found was it looks like stream segregation is going on at that level, but that the event formation was preempted, that complicated finding out what's going on in the other streams. And again, if we go back to thinking about the cocktail party, when you're listening to your friend talking, you can't listen, you can only listen to whether it's the pitch of the voice, there's a male behind you, but you can't know what they're saying simultaneously, what's going on with the events within that stream. My student Renee Simons has a poster, just for a little plug here, which also is doing some follow-ups because we only used frequency as the cue here. And so there are many other ways we can follow up with making the streams more distinctive and to learn what's happening automatically and how it subserves our ability to process what's going on in the background. Okay, so I'm going to now review what does attention do. So the first thing I showed you was attention sharpens the organization towards whatever your behavioral goals are. So you can segregate out sounds at a smaller frequency with attention than happens automatically when there's no task, when it just uses the cues in the input. The second thing was that we can overcome, with attention, we can overcome limitations of the automatic system. If things are obscured, if there's a lot of background stuff going on, but all of a sudden you want to listen to something particularly, you can focus your attention in on that specific thing, and even though it's obscured by other or masked by other noises, you can pull it out. And the third thing is you can select a subset of information, but that can affect processing that's going on in the background. In other words, we can't listen to the within-stream events occurring simultaneously, even though we can get a gross picture of how they're organized. Okay, so the last part of the talk, I'm going to talk about slightly different issue in this scene analysis picture, which is how we resolve ambiguity. What if the information is not clear or can be perceived in multiple ways? What I showed you before was clear segregation. We knew that, we manipulated it as such. And as an example of what I mean by perceptual ambiguity, I ask you, what do you see? You either saw, first off, black shapes, or you saw a word. So the same physical input can give rise to multiple percepts. And when you see the word lift, the black shapes are in the background. And when you see the black shapes, the white is in the background. So the same physical input can be interpreted in multiple ways, and you're using all that information, but you get different percepts from it. Now we're going to take that to the auditory system because we wanted to know, in the auditory system, is there mutual exclusivity? In other words, when there's competition for neural representation, does the one you're attending to win out in neural memory? Or can you have multiple organizations represented in memory even though one of them appears in perception? So now I'm going to walk you through the design because it's a little bit complex. It's not impossible to understand, it's just complex. Now, this is a slight, but you're going to get it easily because it's just variations on what you've seen before. It's a slight variation on the loudness detection task experiment that I showed you. Here we have 3 tones that occur asynchronous in equal distance apart, and then there's a silence, and then 3 tones and a silence. And these all vary in intensity randomly, and that would be the high stream. And here we have in the low stream, now these are 5 semitones distance, and 5 semitones, we've repeated this with so many hundreds and hundreds of subjects that they hear 50% of the time they hear it as 1 stream, 50% of the time they hear a 5 semitone difference as 2 streams. So it's ambiguous in the same sets of subjects, in the same subjects. So what we did here was we created 3 different patterns. For the integrated, this is the first way that you can perceive the sounds as integrated together. And it's either integrated, we call this pattern 1, and this pattern 2, and this pattern 3. The place at which this low tone was inserted in between these 3 higher tones created either pattern 1, pattern 2, or pattern 3. It occurred after the first, second, or the third one. So in order to identify pattern 1, pattern 2, and pattern 3, you have to know where this lower tone belongs with respect to those higher tones. And that would be the integrated percept. For the segregated percept, which would be the other way to hear the sounds, now we're going to do what I've been describing before many times, which is we segregate out the low tones from the higher tones, and we want to listen to these low tone as a separate stream and ignore the high tones. So you can take the same 5 semitone difference, and you can either segregate out the low tones and find that oddball stream, or you can integrate them together to hear the patterns. And when you do this segregated task, you now have a jittered ISI, because the place at which it would have occurred within these makes it feel jittered, makes it actually jittered, because it either occurs here or there or there. So the distance between these is no longer isochronous. It now has a jittered rhythm. Okay, now here's the key. We wanted to know whether the sounds how they were represented in the brain, and we needed to get an objective index, so we couldn't have the same deviant eliciting for segregated and integrated, or they would be confounded. So we had to create a deviant for the integrated percept, and we know what the deviant is for the segregated percept because I've shown you that before. So for the I'm going to show you again, but we needed a separate one for the integrated and a separate one for the segregated, so that if both representations were there, we would have 2 MMNs. Okay, so for the integrated deviance, now this gets a little complicated, but our pattern 1 and pattern 2 were presented 45% each. So together, the standard patterns form 90% of the time. And the deviant pattern was pattern 3. Pattern 3 occurred infrequently. So in order for an MMN to be elicited, the listener would have to detect that there were 2 patterns that occurred more frequently than the third pattern. So it's quite a complex thing for the brain to be doing. Okay. For the segregated deviance, we did what I demonstrated before. We had the intensities vary above and below so that only when the sounds were segregated could an MMN be elicited by the intensity deviant, because we had the intensity standard and the intensity deviant. So we presented this in a task switching paradigm. The same exact sets of sounds, randomized differently across trials, but the same sets of sounds. All the sounds played to the ears had all the different patterns and intensity deviance in them. There was nothing different about any of them. The only thing that differed was how the subject attended to the sounds and which task they performed. And we did this in this task switching paradigm where we would give them a visual cue and tell them which task to do. A set of sounds would come on, I don't remember for how long it was, 10 or 30 seconds. They would do the task, let's say, for 30 seconds, and then the sounds would go off. They'd get another cue. Now they would have to segregate. The sounds would go off. Now detect pattern 1, pattern 3, etc. And these were randomized. So the question was, just to go back to what the reason we're doing this, was when you're performing a task with one organization, what happens to the alternative unattended organization in this situation where the sounds can be heard in multiple ways? And we hypothesized that attention would resolve the ambiguity toward the organization used to perform the task. And that would predict that performing the task would preclude the neural representation of the alternative organization, and therefore we should only see MMN to the task that you're doing. If you're doing the pattern task, there should be only pattern deviance and no intensity deviance. If you're doing the intensity task, there should be only intensity deviance and no pattern deviance. But that's not what happened. And this was really, it was fascinating, is fascinating still, makes a lot of sense, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute. And we also had some control conditions to make sure it wasn't anything that was paradigmatic, because it was the first time we had used this paradigm. What you see here, this is our scalp distribution maps, and the blue is negative and the red is positive. So we're showing the electrodes all around the head. And what you can see is the bilateral distribution of the MMN coming from bilateral auditory cortices, generating the MMN response. The blue is where I was showing you the responses of the traces before, the FC electrode, and the red would be below the Sylvian fissure where we can record it nicely at the mastoid electrode. And so what you see here is when subjects were attending to the pattern and doing the pattern task, and remember they were doing all the pattern tasks. We were looking at pattern 3 was the deviant, and we subtracted the standards from the deviant, pattern 1 and pattern 2 from the deviant. There was an MMN. And when they did the intensity task, when they segregated out the sounds and were pressing the key and they were ignoring those upper sounds, this is the pattern MMN response that they got. And it looks the same amplitude, latency, and same morphology in both cases. And this is what really surprised us, because we thought when you're doing the integrated task, you can't possibly be segregating. When you're doing the segregated task, you can't possibly be integrated. The only difference here is that these are ambiguous at an ambiguous range. And I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more on what this means. And then just to show you they were doing the task, we have, this is, red is positive, and this is the P3B showing the target response. And when they were doing the intensity task, it wasn't significant, though there is a little bit, it looks like a little bit of attention on those patterns. I think the patterns might have been a little bit easier to recognize. When they did the intensity task, so now they're segregating out the sounds, they attended to the intensity, and this was their MMN. And when they attended to the pattern and they were pressing the key for only pattern 1 or pressing the key for only pattern 2, here is the intensity MMN. Again, similar amplitude, latency, and morphology. Both representations were there, no matter which task they were doing. And if you look at the P3B, you can see they were only doing the intensity task when that was their job to do. And when they were attending to the pattern, there's no indication they were attending to the intensity deviance at all. So even when one organization dominates in perception, alternative organizations are represented in the neural trace. You don't lose information. And this is important because auditory information is temporal. So you only have the physical input of the sound to use. Once the input is gone, You only have the neural trace of the physical input once the words are said. And if you lose that information, you can't go back and get anything else. You have to say, what'd you say? And it's still not the same exact thing. So if you're in a noisy situation and you listen to one part of the room and lose everything in the background, how are you ever going to get it back? So when things are overlapping and ambiguous and you can perceive them in multiple ways, your brain holds multiple representations which allow great flexibility for you to be able to switch your attention around the room. And so the attended organization doesn't win out when the information is ambiguous. Attention has access to multiple sound organizations simultaneously. So the conclusions that we can make from what I've talked about, all the things that I've talked about here, are that stream segregation occurs automatically, and it sets the basis for event formation. The first thing you do when you walk in a room, segregate out the sounds, and then the events get formed from within that scene. Attention interacts with automatic processing to facilitate your task goals. So even when things are precluded, you can pull them out if you want to listen to them, if they don't happen automatically. And you have this interaction between what's going on with what your brain does with the stimulus-driven information, and then how attention modifies that input. And the third thing is that you don't lose information when you listen to your friend. You can hear things that are going on. You do lose some of the discrete information of what's going on within the stream, but you don't lose the global picture. And it's a multi-level analysis that involves these interactions. So let's put this all together. A little Bach for you in the morning. So if we're putting it all together, we can think of an orchestra as an example, where you can sit back and listen to the global picture of the orchestra, where you have the harmonies and the passing melodies trading off between the strings and the bass and the reeds, or the brass and the reeds, I should say. Or you can choose to focus in and listen to the melody of the flute. So you have multiple organizations that are represented in neural memory, and this allows you or facilitates your ability to switch back and forth amongst the different streams of events to identify what events are going on in the environment. And as I said a moment ago, there are limitations. You can't pull out all the events that are going on simultaneously, but you can, while you're listening to your friend, get a global picture of what's happening, or when you're listening to the flute, have a global picture also of what's happening. So the main conclusion is that we have both the local and the global representations that allow for great flexibility in the auditory system to allow us to switch our attention around the room and to deal with and facilitate our ability to deal with these noisy situations when there are competing sound streams. So thank you. The last thing I want to do is just acknowledge some contributions from the members of my lab: Kellen Brace, Elizabeth Dinses, Wei Wei Li, Renee Simons, and Joanne Tang. Many of those people are in the room right now. And some of our collaborators who have contributed to the work that I talked about, which is Al Bregman, Kathy Lawson, Alessia Paness, and Mitch Steinschneider. And of course, we always like to thank NIH for allowing us to do this work.
Okay. I did, but now I went the right way. Okay. Thank you all. Some of you may be new, weren't here at the first presentation. We have, due to the generosity of NIDCD, a Research Mentoring Pair Travel Award, and these folks have worked with their mentors to craft some questions for our speaker. So we are going to take those questions first, and then we'll have time for others from the general audience. So, yes, I see someone in the back there. And I ask you to please stand and introduce yourself.
My name's Shay Morgan. I'm from the University of Utah, PhD candidate there. So we're in a complex listening environment. We're attending to one stream, but still processing what's going on around to be aware. Do you think the extent to which we are able to process background depends on our motivation and other preferences for certain things? Like, I don't know, maybe a mother would be more predisposed to hear a baby than somebody talking about the news, or do you think that an individual person's life experiences play into their ability to, or the extent to which they, I'm trying to form this right, but the extent to which they listen in the background for other information?
Oh, that is a great question. There are multiple levels, because that would be a level beyond the actual what's in the stimulus information. And the great William James, the psychologist, I love this part of his book, in the first book, Principles of Psychology. He talked about how the intensity of a sound is, I'm paraphrasing because I can't remember the exact thing, but the intensity of a sound is relative. So that if you're in a situation and you're waiting for your lover to tap on the window to get you to come down on the ladder or whatever, your threshold lowers in order that faint tap on the window sounds like a boom, because you're waiting with such great anticipation. And that same tap, the actual intensity of that sound heard in another environment or in the background of somewhere else would be totally missed. So I always took that to mean exactly what you were saying, that there's this other level of motivation, or like the mother example that you gave, that lowers or raises our threshold depending on what's happening. And if you're taking the GREs and you need to focus on the task, I assume you raise your threshold. But if you're a mother listening for your child, your threshold lowers. I don't know how that works exactly, because that's a different level of processing, but that would be interesting. But it's relative. We do find that the way that you process the sounds is completely relative and has nothing to do with the absolute physical features of the stimulus input. That we do find. So I think that would go along with what you were saying.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Molly Brown. I'm from the University of Pittsburgh. I might have missed you say it earlier, but I wanted to ask anyways, were all of your subjects normal hearing?
Right, I forgot where I was for a second.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes. All of our subjects were normal hearing. We do a hearing screening with all of our subjects to just check to make sure that their hearing status is normal. And if we have any questions, we have Wei Wei Li in the audience, and she does our TIMPs and anything else we need to do. So yes, they have normal hearing, screened. Yeah.
I was just asking, have you ever done any of this research on somebody that doesn't have normal hearing? And do you know how they do in that situation?
Yes, as a matter of fact. I would like to do this more with children, but we have done this. We haven't yet published the data, but we have done this in aging individuals. Elizabeth Dinses, who works in my lab, has a geriatric population. She's a clinical neuro-otologist. And we have taken older adults above 60 years old, a group of 60, group of 70, group of 80-year-olds. And in one group, they have normal audiograms, or what would be considered normal audiograms for that age. And then we also have mild hearing impairment. And we find big differences both in automatic processing and in active attention-based processing, which is part of what we're going to start writing up that happened. The situation is quite different. And the balance between what happens automatically and what happens with attention changes. And we find this also actually in children. It's the automatic system that needs to be refined. People would think, well, it happens automatically. You're born with the architecture to do it. But no, it's the automatic system in children as well that needs to be refined. And then it's like driving a car. You get the skill, and then it works, and then it helps you do what you need to do, and you can do what you need to do even better. And we find that in aging, what seems to be going is this automatic system isn't supporting the attentive system in the way that it used to, which is sort of going to be the message of our paper when it comes out.
Thank you.
Hi, hello. Hi, my name is David Kessler, and I'm a student at Vanderbilt University, and I'm interested in the stream segregation aspect of this, but specifically for speech. And my question is, how specific does this segregation go? For example, if you're listening to a specific voice, are you lumping that one voice as a total segregated entity? Or like you were kind of talking about before, you could really focus on many different parts of like suprasegmentals, for example. You could focus specifically on the intensity of that voice. And would focusing on one specific suprasegmental kind of suppress the other suprasegmentals of that same voice? Or how does that interplay?
Well, at least you're thinking like a scientist now. We haven't done that level of fine detail. The idea is, as you said in the beginning, that the idea is that the voice that's speaking is joined into one stream that has then coherent within stream characteristics. And in the first experiment that I explained to you, I think some of those general auditory mechanisms are involved with speech processing, because you have to integrate and segregate even within a speech stream. But I haven't gone beyond that, looking that in a speech stream, how do you segregate out that further. So I wouldn't be able to answer that, but it does sound like an interesting question to ask. We have looked at what happens, or in the process of looking at what happens when you have multiple cues versus single cues coming from different streams, and how that affects the coherence of the individual streams. And that might play more into, because there are multiple features in a speech stream, so that may play more into how strongly that speech stream coheres, and whether you hear it as separate items or whether it's just differences within the single stream.
Hi, my name is Samantha Gustafson. I'm a PhD candidate at Vanderbilt, and I want to go back for a second to the automatic processing of the unattended signal. And I'm wondering if you've looked at within your experiment over time, if that automatic signal or processing reduces after a period of time where they're asked to process, and whether or not that might tell us something about fatigue and our ability to use that automatically processed signal when we're exhausted.
Okay, I want to make sure I understand. Are you saying, I'm going to say what I think you mean and then tell me if that's correct. Are you saying that if we looked at the beginning versus the end of the session, or the end of the...
Yes, of the session. So in the first 50 trials versus the last 50 trials, would you expect to see the same type of or the same strength of automatic processing? I'm not sure how long your sessions are. If they're short, it may not matter. But if you lengthen them, it may be that their motivation or their fatigue, motivation reduces, fatigue kicks in, and that automatic processing is not as robust.
So that is a good question. There are effects of fatigue that I've heard about. We have not really analyzed it in that way. We have to average together a lot of trials, and we would have to design the experiment in order to have enough trials to look at the beginning and the middle and the end. And usually when we have done it to look at the beginning, the middle, and the end, we had not fatigue issues, but learning issues or training issues. Like if you're doing a really difficult task, how do you perform in the beginning versus how do you perform at the end? I've never seen, just informally over the decades that I've been doing this, fatigue measures in the automatic processing, but I've seen fatigue measures in behavioral. But I can't think of that. I can't swear that I've checked it systematically, but it's an interesting question. But I think the fatigue comes in more when you're listening, focusing, and doing the task. That's where we've seen more fatigue issues come in. But when you're watching a movie or doing something less strenuous, and we haven't really noticed that there's a difference that's based on fatigue.
Okay. And how about habituation throughout the task?
Meaning, I mean, I know what
does that
habituation
affect-
is, but what do you mean?
Does that affect the attended to or the unattended processed signal differently?
I'm not sure. Could you could you
Yes.
elaborate just a little bit more?
So you have your two segregated streams. You have your attended and your unattended. Does the effect of habituating to the task affect those two streams differently? Or do you see habituation in your paradigm? I guess is the first question.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what you're asking. So there's refractoriness in the ERPs, where the first sound you played gets a robust response, and every sound after that gets a smaller response. Actually, one of the slides that Barbara showed was a perfect example of that. And we don't see habituation in the ERP response because we don't see a decrement from tone to tone to tone. The first tone is large, and then the next one is reduced, and it asymptotes, and it stays reduced. So there's no real habituation in the ERPs. So then that's probably not what you were asking, though. So actually, I'm not sure what you were asking.
That's okay. We can chat later.
Let's talk later. Yes. Maybe you meant when they're doing the same task over and over again. And then what do you want to know about that? Let's talk later. Okay. I'll try to get more information so you can explain to me what you mean, and then I'll be able to answer your question. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me okay? I'm Jessie Erickson from the University of Arizona, and I had a question about one of your methodological decisions. So a lot of the examples we talked about where you choose to attend to certain sounds or certain parts of the auditory environment, you're not explicitly told to ignore the other sounds, but in your experiments, I noticed that participants were often or always explicitly told to ignore certain sounds, or you can ignore these, as opposed to just emphasizing what to focus on or what to attend to. And so I was curious about your a model of attention that might have motivated this, or your theoretical framework that motivated this methodological decision.
No, this is a good question. This kind of question comes up all the time because people don't really understand what attention is. And so, and we're still trying to learn what attention is. What we tell the subjects, first I'll just tell you what we usually tell the subjects. I no longer tell my subjects ignore the sounds because there's no such thing, and I don't really want them to. What we tell them is, you're gonna hear sounds played in your ears. Tell us if you don't hear the sounds, because that's the first. We want them to hear the sounds. And then we tell them what task to do, either watch a movie or do a task with the sounds. Here's my thinking about that. I'll just give you a quick, well, I won't talk too long about this because I could talk quite a long time about this. My thinking about this, when I first started, people used to say, you're ignoring the sounds, it's pre-attentive processing. And then everybody would argue, but it's not pre-attentive processing. They might have sneaked peeks and this kind of thing. There's no such thing as pre-attentive processing, because when you wake up, you're attending to something. And you have awareness of all the things that are going on in your environment. So there's not pre-attentive. There's a different way that you focus on the sounds. And what I want to look at now is if you focus on a movie or on a visual task, and the sounds are in the background and you don't have any information about that sounds, you don't care about it because you're being paid to watch a movie, what does your brain do with the sounds? Or if I tell you to focus on a set of sounds and listen for something, are you hearing it? What does your brain tell us about what it is that you're doing with those sounds? And then how does that modify what was happening in the background that we saw before? So I want to redirect your attention in multiple different ways. So in that experiment I showed you with the grouping, the random oddball, and then every fifth tone, it was a group. We had two forms of attention in that experiment. We had them ignore and watch a movie, or I said ignore, forgive me. We had them watch a movie, and then we had them listening to the sounds, but listening to the pitches of the sounds, and pressing the key when they heard a rare pitch. And when they did that, we got an MMN to the pink, what would have been the pink one, because the pitches, the pitches were of interest, and so all the pitches were being recorded. But when we asked them to take that same set of sounds, they were grouped. Let me say that they were grouped when we had them listening to the pitches. Now we had them take the same set of group sounds, but we said there's a 5-tone repeating pattern, and listen to that. And on the basis of the 5-tone repeating pattern, press the key when you hear a pattern change. And they were pressing the key to the same tones as they did when we had them press the pitch, listen for pitches. Then no MMN was elicited. So it wasn't that they were listening to the same set of grouped sounds in two different ways, got an MMN when they listened to the pitches and no MMN when they listened to the pattern. So it isn't that it's just ignore or attend. It's where you're directing your attention. How are you using the information that's coming in your ears? What makes a difference? It's the same like when the high-toned stream got obscured because the automatic system didn't need to use that information. It was just a lot of stuff going on there. But when you needed to use that information, attention could pull out those events. So it was affecting a different level of the system. So I like to think of it in terms of the levels of the system and how they're interacting together.
Hi, Sophie Schwartz from Boston University. I was wondering about your behavioral work, looking at the differentiation of two streams based on semitone difference, and wondering how long you gave individuals, these adults, how much time you gave them to be able to say if the two streams were the same or different, and when you're finding this 5 semitone sort of threshold, did that get lower when you, perhaps, if you gave them more time?
Okay, so I think I understand your question too, because there's what we call a build-up period before. Sometimes you can hear things as integrated before you hear them as segregated, right? So we far surpassed the build-up period. I think they had 10 to 20 seconds. I don't remember the exact number. When they had to say, "Is it sound more like 1 or more like 2?" And we had them wait until the end of the sequence before they gave their response. So they listened to the sequence of sounds, and we said, even if you think you know what it is, listen to the whole thing and give us the response at the end. The thing that is, the other thing that we did was, we didn't present a 5 semitone sequence and get one response and then present another one and get a response. We mixed up and randomized whether they got a 1, a 5, 11, 7, all randomized up. So the 5 came in after many different things, so they couldn't, maybe habituate would be a good word here, they couldn't habituate to segregation or to integration and have that hysteresis effect change what they were perceiving. It was all randomized. And no matter how many times we randomize this and how many participants we asked to do this, on average, we get 50% of the time when that 5 semitones ones come up, they say 1 semitone half of the time, and 1 stream half the time, and 2 streams the other half of the time. And we don't find a difference. The loudness detection task is true. It's going on for minutes, and they're doing this. And we get very similar, consistent responses across different groups of subjects where it's ambiguous for the 5 semitones difference and segregated. We have an integrated region around 1 semitones, an ambiguous region around 5 semitones, and a clearly segregated region 11 semitones and above for adults with normal hearing. Not the true for kids. I didn't quite get the last piece. Oh, okay. That's a really great question and something that I'm quite interested in. We measure, I'm not a clinician, and we want to know what the average group response is so that if we were to pick somebody out of the crowd, we can say this is what we expect their response would be. We see a great deal of individual variation, and part of what we want to do is maintain that variance so that we can know whether this is something that happens in a group or it's just specific to a certain individual or group of individuals. And we do see individual variation. So for example, I said 5 semitones is the ambiguous region. Well, there are a large number of people for 3 semitones, it's the ambiguous region. And we can tell that. But when it comes to, can we tell the difference between auditory processing disorder or attention deficit disorder, there are so many factors that feed into the individual variance in a child with auditory processing disorder or attention deficit disorder. At the moment, The measures, I haven't had a chance to systematically study which measures we can use to sort through that question, which is something that I'd like to do, because we're now getting a handle on what attention does in kids and what is important in kids, and it's very different from what it does in adults. But right now, we're still at the group level, so we can't quite answer the question yet, but I would like to.
Hi, I'm Christy Ward. I'm a PhD AUD student at Northwestern. I was your study that the methodology was looking at the integration or segregation question. That kind of got me thinking about how much experience plays into this ability to segregate a stream, especially a complex stream. For instance, if you were presenting you're presented with the same complex stimulus, you need to kind of experience that stimulus over some given time period in order to then learn enough about the stimulus to move forward with the segregation component. At least that's kind of what I was thinking about in regards to the methodology that you presented. Do you have any comments on that kind of that experience component and how it would relate to like the cocktail party effect?
Oh, that's an interesting, complicated question. So I'll parse it down a little bit. The experience question, we find that people who get experienced with our really complex paradigms do better as they get more experience. And actually, Kellen Brace, one of the students in my lab, is just finding some evidence that's supporting that, and we want to follow up on that. We do find, however, that most people who come into the lab, but not all people that come into the lab, can do the very complicated tasks. I remember when I was doing my dissertation, I had, the pitch patterns. And in the experiment I showed you, they were ignoring in one case, but in another case, they were attending. And I remember having a subject, I said, you have to listen to the high stream and press the key every time the three tones reverse. And for me, it was crystal clear what that meant. And they weren't doing the task. And I said, what's happening? And they said, well, I can hear that there are high tones and I can hear that there are low tones, but I don't hear that rising pitch pattern. And it was the first time I had encountered that. And then I had encountered that a couple more times. There's a great deal of variation amongst individuals in what happens. And we have found that if you train them on a particular paradigm, that they can get better at the paradigm. And musicians are better at most things because they've been trained to listen in a different way. So there is that element that can come into it. But most people can do what we ask them to do without any training. Everyone gets a practice period to do it. So I'm not sure of the extent of the training that you were talking about, but the people who are working in our labs, the students working in our labs, after they hear the same sounds over and over and over and over, they're really great at it. So
yeah, and I guess I was not referring to the experience with the task as much as just the experience of having the auditory stream that you're listening to. So if after a while, it almost seems like in some of your tests, at least, you have to be able to first recognize that there is a pattern, which requires you to listen to the sound for a certain amount of time before you can move forward with segregation. So I guess it's more like your experience with the auditory signal itself.
So we think the segregation occurs first, and then they're finding the patterns. Yeah, and that they sometimes can find the patterns and sometimes cannot find the patterns. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Adam Bozen from Boys Town. I'm a postdoc there. And I was curious, this might be kind of a weird question, but I was thinking about, so usually the results you show that attentional focus on a particular feature sharpens your ability to detect mismatches in that feature. Are there conditions under which the opposite might be true, where, say, active attention is degrading your ability to detect a mismatch, say, by degrading your ability to understand or to group the standard into a single stream?
Okay, so this is a good question, because the MMN, I'm first going to clarify one thing. The MMN is an outcome measure that shows what the brain detected is changing. And it's the tool we use so that we can understand what's represented in memory. And what we have found, when I say it's highly context dependent, is that whichever way you listen to the sounds, whichever way you group them, will influence whether MMN is elicited or not because it will influence what the standard is, what the event is. And so the question that you had was, what was the question that you had? That
So essentially in that
oh,
context
can you,
is,
so if you change the way the sound, now I remember, if you change the way the sounds are grouped, then MMN will no longer be elicited in the way that I showed you, that if you take what would be a deviant if it occurred infrequently in the block and made it part of the standard, then you no longer get an MMN because now it's not a deviant, but it's still a frequency change. Okay, so that would take a frequency change that would elicit MMN if you were ignoring, then is not elicited when it's grouped together because that's what your task is. So you can go back and forth, but what is crucial is what's represented in memory as being the repeated element, repeated elements in the signal. Then MMN's only like the dumb output thing. If there was a change in there, it'll elicit MMN. If there's no change in there, then you won't get an MMN because there was no change to be had.
Dr. Sussman? I was wondering, at the end, at your conclusion, you were showing the symphony orchestra playing Bach. And I was wondering, in terms of variations of the subjects, if you were, let's say, to get a group of conductors and a group of musicians who are like composers, who are able to listen linearly and then also vertically and hear everything holistically. So let's say, for example, some of these people are capable of training their brains so that they can, let's say, hear a Brahms 6-part violin piece and then also hear Philip Glass and know everything that's going on. So apparently, from what you're saying, that they're training their brains to hear the individual portions, but they're also doing something in meta musically, and they're putting it all together and capable of hearing this. So in terms of attention, is the human brain, let's say, capable of doing that beyond what we do normally in terms of, let's say, helping children with ADHD and training them using musical tones, musical line, and focusing just like a composer or a conductor would do?
Well, the last part would be interesting to find out. But I think what I'm saying here is that we usually say that attention limits all of our processing. And the evidence that I provided today shows that we still process quite a lot of the information that's going on in the background, even when we're attending to something. We get the global picture and the local picture. But what we can't get, what does get limited, is being able to follow simultaneous within-stream events, two voices, two streams of speech at the same time, two melodies on two different instruments at the same time. But we can listen to the melody and hear the global harmony. We can listen to our friends speak and hear other things, glasses clinking, other sort of random objects in the background that have different pitches or different elements that aren't at the level of within-stream characteristics. It would be very interesting to follow up to see what that would mean, if there's any way that we could capitalize on this to take advantage of it for children who have difficulties in noisy scenes. Because it isn't just that we filter out everything that's in the background. We still monitor simultaneous streams of information going on for the use of it if we want to switch our attention around the room.
Hello, I'm Nick Stanley from the University of South Alabama. My question is really, when you look at these three separate streams and that occurring MMN, is there an extent in the number of streams where that MMN may not become obvious and present?
Aha, that's a good. We've asked that question. There may be a limitation to that. It's really challenging to design we tried to do 5 streams. It's really challenging to design a paradigm that doesn't confound the deviance across all the streams and find a way to do that. And we haven't found a way to do that. So then we don't know, because with 5 streams, we weren't able to see 5 clear MMNs. So then we weren't able to, and of course it wasn't published because you don't publish null results, right? So then it's not clear, though, whether we couldn't design the paradigm in order to pick out the 5 streams, or whether you can't represent more than 4 streams. If we take the 7 plus or minus 2 that Barbara mentioned before, and we do the Nelson-Cowan modulation of that theory to the 4 plus or minus 3, or I don't know, whatever he said, if 4 things is the most that we can, 4 chunks of things. It's not 7 individual events, but you make the phone number into 2 chunks of things. And so Cowan sort of extended that to say, well, you can do 4 chunks of things. Maybe 5 was beyond the limits of what could be done with the automatic system. I don't know which is the answer. I would like to find out. I just haven't followed down that pathway. It gets so complicated to try to segregate, make a paradigm where you can have 7 different discrete items. But maybe there is a way to do that.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Sussman for a very provocative talk.